Science is the great antidote to the poison of enthusiasm and superstition. Hi, I'm Juliette Sellgren, and this is my podcast, The Great Antidote, named for Adam Smith, brought to you by Liberty Fund. To learn more, visit www.adamsmithworks.org. Welcome back. For as long as I can remember, and maybe for as long as you can remember, but I don't know, maybe not. I haven't been around for that long. People worried about the overpopulation of the planet. Now, although people are still worried about an overpopulated planet, they're also worried about declining birth rates. There's a lot going on. Today, on April 28th, 2023, I'm looking forward to getting into some of these claims and why people say them and if it's really a thing to be worrying about with Marian Tupy. Marian is a senior fellow at the Cato Institute and the author of the recently released Superabundance and another book, 10 Global Trends Every Smart Person Should Know. They're both great. Check them out. Today, we're going to be talking about his newest book. So welcome to the podcast.
Thank you very much. Happy to be with you.
Before we get started, what is the most important thing that people my age or in my generation should know that we don't?
You should know that you are not a cancer on the planet. You should know that you are both a consumer and a destroyer, but you're also a creator and an innovator. There is so much in the news about how having more people on the planet, having more young people being born is horrible because you are going to consume all sorts of resources and you are going to do a lot of damage to the planet. But in reality, whilst that is true, you're also going to be very beneficial to the planet and to your species as well as to the animals. So a human being is a destroyer, but he's also a creator. And so don't buy into the negativity and pessimism and that sort of thing that you read in the newspapers or see on TV. Don't feel guilty about having a good life on the planet. Enjoy it. And the best thing that you can do is not to be pessimistic or guilty about having a good life, but try to contribute something to the stock of human knowledge so that when you are dead, people can say that you have contributed more than you have subtracted from the planet.
That's a great point. I've been thinking a lot about this recently because a lot of people I've been talking to have been, well, first saying that we're destroying the planet, but also that we're not functioning as humans the way we're supposed to, and we're not behaving in our nature. But that's a little weird to me because obviously part of what makes our nature so great compared to a lot of other animals, not necessarily better, but different, what makes humans stand out and so prosperous is that we have our brains. And so anything that comes from our brains, I would think any sort of creation, even if it's creative destruction, seems to be within our nature. So it just seems a little bit weird to me. And I've never really understood that almost.
Well, it seems to me that, and we'll probably get into it more in detail, but basically biologists cannot get their heads around the fact that humans are fundamentally different from other animals. Other animals don't innovate. We do. So when other animals consume all the resources, all the grass after a rainy season, they procreate, they have a lot of babies and they consume everything and then they all die off because they run out of food. Humans are different. We create artificial fertilizer from natural gas called ammonia. We create genetically modified foods which can increase the yield of crops on fewer acres of land, thereby leaving more land for nature. The fact is that we are animals. We are in the direct line all the way to few million years ago when we shared it with chimps, but we have learned to innovate. Other animals don't know how to innovate. We do. So that's the fundamental difference, I think.
And we will come full circle back to that. So let's start with the book's title, Superabundance. What is superabundance? What does that even mean?
Superabundance has a technical definition. superabundance is when things are becoming more abundant at a faster rate than population growth. So let me backtrack a little bit. For many decades, possibly even centuries, people believed that when you have population growth, things are going to become less abundant. You are going to have fewer you're going to have less corn, you are going to have fewer barrels of oil, etc., etc. And that's not what's happening in the world. In fact, almost everything we look at is increasing in abundance. That's what we found in our research. Population growth is actually related to abundance. The more people you have, the more innovations you have. So you end up having more stuff, more abundance of resources. But abundance of resources can increase at two different speeds. It can increase at a lower rate than population growth. So let's say population grows at 2% and abundance increases at 1%. We just call that increasing abundance. But when abundance increases at a faster rate than population, so let's say population again grows at 2%, but abundance is increasing at about 3%, then that's what we call superabundance. And that's in fact what we are finding, is that everything is growing at a superabundant rate. And that's what tells us that on average, human beings create more value than they consume. On average, every human being creates more and contributes to the stock of human knowledge.
So what compelled you to write a book about superabundance and to research this topic now?
Well, I would say that about 20 years ago, I started noticing that the environmental movement, or rather the concept of environmentalism was really taking off, and it was becoming extremely important in public policy debates. Now, I consider myself an environmentalist in a sense that I care about nature. I want clean nature. I want clean planet. I want animals and flora and fauna to have plenty of space to flourish. But I do think that it's very important to try to balance the needs of the planet with the needs of human beings. And it seemed to me about 20 years ago that the pendulum started to shift far too much towards the planet. In other words, whatever it is that benefits nature is good, and the welfare of human beings shouldn't factor in those calculations. And that's what greatly worried me. And so I started looking into what I would call extreme environmentalism as opposed to just ordinary environmentalism. Ordinary environmentalists, people like Steven Pinker or Bjorn Lomborg, they all care about the environment, but they understand that humans have their needs as well. Extreme environmentalists, they don't factor in the human needs. And so what I started noticing was an increase in news stories about things like humans are a cancer on the planet. If you are having a child, every child born into the world is an act of selfishness. You are destroying the planet by having a baby because the baby is going to produce X thousands of tons of CO2 whilst they're alive. And that just seemed to me totally out of whack, partly not just because of moral considerations, but also because what I saw was that the richer the country, the better the environment. Okay. So it wasn't that people who don't have anything and sparse populations have great environments. In fact, go anywhere into the third world, into developing countries, and you'll notice that people don't really care very much about the environment. But it seemed to me that there was a strong correlation between economic growth and general wealth of a society and good environment. So I thought to myself, well, there has to be a way of punching against this particular death cult of extreme environmentalism, which sees human beings as a problem rather than as a solution. And that's what led me to updating the famous Julian Simon and Paul Ehrlich wager. And together with Gale Pooley, we basically took that wager all the way back to 1850, and we looked at hundreds of different commodities, and we ended up with the same result.
Can you actually explain to us a little bit about who did you say, Julian Simon and Paul Ehrlich? Can you tell us about their wager?
Sure. So in 1968, Paul Ehrlich who is a biologist at Stanford University and who is still alive, just turned 90, published a very famous book called The Population Bomb, in which he predicted hundreds of millions of people would die in the 1970s and 1980s due to starvation because the planet would be overpopulated and we would be running out of stuff. Nothing like that happened. In fact, the number of calories consumed per person have increased. Famines have basically disappeared from the world outside of war zones. That has never happened before, that humanity has had so much food. Now, there is still food insecurity, but famines have disappeared, which is what Ehrlich was predicting. And so in 1980, an economist from University of Maryland called Julian Simon, who was also at that time a senior fellow at Cato, challenged him to a public bet. Ehrlich chose 5 commodities. I think it was tin, copper, tungsten, chromium, and something else, zinc. And basically the bet would last for 10 years. And basically they both agreed that population of the world between 1980 and 1990 would increase. But Simon was saying that as population increases, those 5 commodities would decline in price, whereas Ehrlich was saying that the 5 commodities would increase in price, right? Because you have more people, therefore you have more demand, therefore the price should reflect that. And so when the bet came to an end in 1990, September 29th, to be exact, actually those 5 commodities have dropped by something like 38%. In real price. And so Ehrlich lost this bet, and Simon won. So that's what the bet was about. Now that should have been the end of the discussion. In other words, a lot of people were expecting that since Ehrlich lost that bet and Simon won, that all the doomsters would stop promoting their doomstor's message. But in fact, that hasn't happened, and So there was a lot of negativity that has continued. And so what I wanted to do with Gale is to basically look at the bet going back as far as we could take it, which was to 1850. And instead of looking at, instead of a decade, we have 168 years of data. And instead of 5 commodities, we looked at hundreds of different commodities, minerals, metals, fuels, food items. And indeed, what we found that all of them became cheaper.
So you looked a lot at resources and not just the earth. Like I'm thinking about how, okay, so resources, a lot of the reason why a lot of people care about overpopulation is because of resources. And so we're going to get into that in a little bit. But there are also a lot of people who care about the environment and overpopulation because they don't think there's enough space for humans. Is that the case?
Yes. So the strong version of this argument is that we are simply going to run out of, material stuff. We are going to run out of copper and zinc and oil and chickens and whatever. The soft version of it is that no, we are not going to run out of all of these resources, but human activity is going to have such profound impact on the biosphere that all of these life enhancing and life promoting systems are going to collapse. We are going to poison water. We are going to poison air. We are going to build on every square inch of the planet until the moment comes when basically these biospheres are going to die and we are going to die with them. Now, so that's the sort of the weaker or the more updated version of the problem. And there is plenty of arguments to suggest that that's not going to happen either. One of the things that's happening around the world is that you have urbanization. Already over half of humanity lives in cities. By 2080 or by 2100, something like 85% of all humans will be living in the cities. So you're going to release basically millions of acres of land back to nature because you no longer need it, right? And so that's part of the reason why we are not going to sort of destroy the biosphere. Secondly, the richer the countries become, the more they care about the environment. You will notice that there is a push to create nature reserves, protect rivers and oceans all over the world. Already today, something like 15% of all land, which is twice the size of the United States, is protected from human exploitation. These are nature reserves around the world. And something like 7% of oceans, which is the area twice the size of South America, are already protected from human exploitation through international treaties. That number is going to rise to 30%. So the argument I'm making is that the wealthier the society is, the more money we have, the more resources we have to basically protect the environment, carve out huge chunks of the United States for nature reserves where where animals can flourish. And finally, I think it's very important to understand that as we become more efficient in food production, growing food on fewer acres of land because of GMOs, for example, you can now grow much more food per acre of land than you could 200 years ago. Plus, we can genetically modify crops to such extent that you need less fertilizer and less pesticide, which is very important because of its outflow into the oceans. So all of these things combined tell me that the future of the biosphere and the future of flora and fauna is actually very bright.
You mentioned when you were talking about the wager that was done before your book, that they measured everything in real prices. Your methodology is kind of different, and it's pretty interesting. Can you tell us about how you measured prices and why the difference is important?
Sure. So the simplest price that every student at Virginia will know is nominal price. Every time you go to a shop and you buy a loaf of bread or whatever, a can of beer, that's the nominal price. That's the price on the day that you are buying it. But everybody knows that if you are comparing prices across time, if you want to know if something is becoming more expensive or less expensive, you have to account for inflation. That's where real prices come into it. Real price is basically just the nominal price minus the inflation rate. And they both serve a purpose, but they have one huge shortcoming, and that is that they don't look into what is happening in your wallet. So let's say that the nominal price of something has doubled from $2 to $4. But if your income has tripled from $5 to $15, then you are much better off. And so time prices basically take into account both the prices that you see in the store, but also the wages in your pocket. Let's say that an apple costs you $1, and then you're making $1 an hour. So that means it's going to be an hour of your labor, right? So that's the time price. Your time price is an hour of labor. You're earning $1. The apple costs $1. The apple costs an hour of labor, right? You're with me.
Yep.
Now let's say that in 10 years time, the apple still costs $1, but you are now earning $2 an hour. So now the apple will cost you only 30 minutes of labor. And therefore you can get 2 apples for an hour of work. So that's what time prices are. They divide the nominal price of a good or a service by the nominal wages in year 1, and then in year 10 or 20 you repeat the process. You divide the nominal price of a good or a service by the nominal hourly wage, and you get a result, and you are able to appreciate whether for the same length of labor or the same number of hours, you can get more or less of something. And that's very important because productivity mirrors or reflects itself not just in falling prices of goods, but also in increases in wages. So time price allows you very elegantly to put these two productivity gains into one price or one number. Did I explain that in a sort of a comprehensible way?
Yeah. And then, I mean, you kind of mentioned this before, but to me, changes in wages, for whatever reason they change, I think it's a really interesting thing to capture. But what just occurred to me is that innovation is part of what changes wages. And that's something that's so fundamentally human. But it seems as though innovation is like part of the missing part of the puzzle.
If you just deal with prices, in other words, if you just deal with prices of wheat, then all you see is that the wheat has dropped in price. Yes, that's true. But what is happening in your pocket? Has the money increased because you become more productive? And once you put these together, you get the time price.
It's an awesome way of measuring things, I think. So superabundance, again, it seems to imply that maybe we're already living in, or that we're going to continue living in, a future, a world with limitless resources and opportunities. I mean, I already consider my life, the world in America that I'm living in, to be that, but it's going to continue and spread. How do you envision that playing out in reality, and what factors are necessary to continue achieving this state?
Well, there are a lot of different directions you could take it, but I think it is very important to start with the following. There's nothing deterministic in our work. What we are showing is that over the last 150 or 200 years, when humanity embraced reason and logic and human dignity, greater freedom, some form of free market capitalism, we have managed to produce a lot of good stuff, right? That's what we are showing, is that historically speaking, the last 200 years are fundamentally different from previous 300,000 years. Because of all the things that I've mentioned, humanity has become much better off. But there is no reason to think, or rather there is no reason to be certain that this has to continue. We could embrace protectionism. We could, whereby nations cannot trade together. We could embrace an extreme form of precautionary principle, that you cannot introduce a new innovation unless you can be absolutely certain that it will not do any harm, and consequently all innovation will ground to a halt. You could have nuclear conflict. You can have asteroids destroying the Earth. So there's nothing predetermined in what we are saying. The best we can do is to say, look, if human beings continue to embrace some form of economic and political freedom, if they continue to rely on science and reason and meritocracy, if they continue to treat each other with dignity and equality, then we are going to probably continue to increase our abundance. Now, so that's point number one. There's no deterministic element there. Secondly, I would say that whereas it is true that life in the United States is pretty good, there's no reason to think that it cannot be awesome, once again, with the proviso that it is not predetermined. I mean, if you think about that famous piece of writing by Keynes from just before the First World War, where he talks about the abundance of living in England as a upper middle class or a rich person in 1914 or 1913, he had access to the telegraph. He could trade stocks in New York Stock Exchange. He had access to all sorts of food that was previously unavailable. And that was 100 years ago. And he already thought that he was living in a pretty good, a pretty good life. He could not have imagined how much people will have in 2023. Now, so I cannot predict all the ways in which people 100 years from now would be looking back at 2023 and say, oh my God, look how poor those people were, right? Goodness knows what gadgets and what life-enhancing technology is going to be produced, which will become a necessity. 20 years ago, I didn't know that I needed a $600 computer in my pocket at all times, called a smartphone or an iPhone, right? But it's an expensive equipment, which is now basically part of your life, no matter whether you live in Washington, D.C. or you live in Rio de Janeiro, Brazil. So goodness knows what sort of things will be considered to be just a normal standard of living that will require a lot of money to purchase. But I suspect that people 100 years from now will consider us very poor indeed.
I can't
and not to mention,
imagine, but
and the last thing, which is very important, and that is that we must never forget all those extreme environmentalists out there who think that we have enough growth. Must never forget that there are billions of people in the world who have much less than people in the United States or indeed Western Europe. In fact, Western European incomes are probably half of what they are in the United States. We are really extremely rich society on average in the United States. But when you look at Africa and Latin America and parts of Asia, big parts of Asia, you see that there is still a lot of goodness that can be produced as a result of rapid economic growth and abundance there. So the point I'm trying to make is that yes, life for everyone is pretty much everyone is much better than what it was 50 or 100 years ago, but it is nowhere as good as it could be.
I mean, I'm with you there. But okay, so you mentioned free markets, and there's this interesting, I'm taking industrial organization right now, and there's this interesting finding with respect to innovation that in monopolies, you don't get as much innovation as free markets, something we might take for granted. But I proved it the other day, and it's pretty cool. What about your results indicate that free markets are the right institution for superabundance?
Well, some of our country results clearly point to it. For example, we look at the period. Well, we go back all the way to 1850 in some of our data sets. But if you look at the period between 1980 and say 2018 or even 2023, it's clear that China is the star pupil of the last 40 years. Really staggering amount of abundance that was created in that country. And why should China be the star pupil? And the argument that I would make was that, after 1978, when China stops being a mad, crazy communist dictatorship, totalitarian dictatorship, it becomes an authoritarian country. China was never free. China is an authoritarian country, but it is no longer a crazy, homicidal, totalitarian dictatorship of Mao Zedong. Once economic freedom took off in China, they were able to create a lot of wealth, a lot of abundance for their people. And so I think that sort of the evidence in superabundance points to the fact that countries which have reformed have done extremely well, especially in the last 40 years. The other elements that we discussed, well, we have this model, right? The model is that you need people because people are the only entity capable of creating new ideas, and new ideas then lead to innovations, and innovations lead to productivity gains, and productivity gains lead to higher standards of living. So we know that population is important because, again, only human beings are able to create new ideas. But they also need freedom. Right? If China, for example, China was united like 221 BC. So it's been the most populous country until this year for about 2,200 years. And it was very poor until recently, right? So population in itself cannot be the only answer. It needs to be something else. And we think that superabundance is really population times freedom. That's when you get superabundance. If you just have a lot of people without freedom, they're going to be poor. But if you give them freedom to create new ideas and to benefit from those ideas, then I think that future can be very abundant indeed.
So, I mean, this kind of begs the question, should we be worried about fertility rates? Because I hear people all around me worrying. On one hand, we have too many people. On the other hand, our countries will perish because the fertility rates are below 1 or around 1 or something like that. Is this a threat to the future of superabundance, and or should we actually be worried about this?
So it's not the same people who worry about overpopulation on the one hand and underpopulation on the other hand. There are two different groups of people, right? I am moderately concerned that that decrease in birth rates could have negative consequences for future growth. Okay. Now that is not a concern that many people will have. Many people just don't care about growth. They think they're just fine and we don't need more growth. I think that we need as much growth as we can get for a variety of reasons. And therefore I am concerned that in the future, with fewer people being born, we are going to have fewer ideas and consequently less growth. Now, how could you arrest that problem? You could arrest it or rather reverse it, by having more people live in freedom. So as I said, to us, superabundance is the outcome of population times freedom. So if you're going to have a shrinking population, you could still have a lot of growth if more countries embrace freedom. Right now, huge chunks of Africa and Latin America and Asia are unfree. A lot of young people who are born there who may contribute to human knowledge and economic growth are not really contributing because they are living under a system which doesn't permit human flourishing from taking place, human ingenuity from taking place. And so you could have a spurt of freedom which compensates for lack of new babies being born. Alternatively, we could have artificial intelligence or supercomputing, quantum computing, and things like that, which will compensate for fewer human beings being born. That's certainly possible, but that's not. We are not there yet. Let me tell you why we wrote the book. Partly, we are not. If there is one thing I cherish more than economic growth, it is freedom. So under no circumstances I want our book to be misinterpreted as saying that parents should be forced to having more children than they are. That should be left up to them. What concerns me is that huge chunks of young people around the world are saying that they don't want to have children because they believe that the world is going to end, that we are going to run out of resources, that bringing a child into the world is an act of selfishness, etc. Our book is intended for those young people, those young people your age and older who are thinking about starting a family, but who have been so freaked out by the extreme environmentalists into believing that the world is going to end that they are refusing to have children. And we have opinion polls in the book which show that, in fact, this is the case. So our book is to say to all of these young people, if you want to have 2 kids, have 2 kids. If you want to have 3 or 4 kids, have 3 or 4 kids. It's totally up to you. Don't worry about the doom and gloom scenarios. That's if we can. So we are hoping to make a difference on the margin, but ultimately people will have as many children as they want to.
This sort of doom and gloom narrative inevitably has psychological and cultural implications. I mean, you see the suicide rates and the depression and all of that. And obviously, there are more causes, but people obviously don't see or don't believe that we're in a time of superabundance. So what are we up against, and why don't people see that we're in a time of superabundance? It
is certainly possible that, people who live amidst abundance would, for example, devote themselves so much to pleasure that they will no longer want to have children. But that is not really what we are seeing in some developed countries. I mean, here Israel is a very interesting example. Israel has experienced 20 years of very rapid economic growth. It is now a rich country, and the Israelis continue to have a lot of children, not just Orthodox Jews, but also secular Jews. And so that tells us that when you have a lot of wealth, people can still have a lot of children. They can still choose to have a lot of children. There is no unavoidable connection between living in a prosperous society and having fewer kids. Maybe it has something to do with the general optimism with which people see the future, and but that's something that still needs to be properly analyzed. I personally. My personal view is that the reason why so much in the United States is now dominated by negativity and anxiety and depression and very often suicide, has actually to do with the fact that news over the last 20 years has become much darker and much more negative than it used to be. Now, I have some thoughts about why that may have happened. There are papers that have shown that over the last 20 years, both the headlines and news content has become much more negative. So even though the world continues to improve and has improved massively over the last 20 years, and Americans are unambiguously richer than they were 20 years ago, the news is much more negative. So why would that happen? And my view is that a couple of things are going on. One is that, of course, if it bleeds, it leads. In other words, if you want to sell newspapers or if you want people to continue to be glued to the television sets at 8 o'clock watching the news, you need to overemphasize the bad things because that's what gets people's attention. Good things don't generally get people's attention. Bad things do. And so I think that for that reason, you have competition going on. Where the more horrific thing you can report on, the more likely it is that people are going to watch you or read you. And the second thing is that, of course, you also have negativity in the headlines. There was a recent study that showed that every additional negative term in a headline increases the click rate by something like 2.3 or 2.5%, which is a lot. And so when you have a lot of competing media against one another, there is, in my view, this is a hypothesis that I have, there is, in my view, this sort of drive to the bottom where they try to outdo each other in terms of more horrific headlines. And so I think that in spite of the world improving, you have this weird effect of people's psyche being influenced by a particular business model of the media. Did that make any sense?
Yeah, no, that made a ton of sense. Do you think that, and I mean, this is kind of going far out, extrapolating this, do you think that that could get in the way of the superabundance trajectory that we're on?
Yeah, totally. One reason would be that if you see every possible invention, not just as a source of human improvement or planetary improvement, but as a source of potential end of the world, then you may want to, through your activism, actually undermine that innovation and bring it to an end or a halt. A perfect example of that was, of course, nuclear power, fission power. Had we continued exploring safer, better, cheaper ways of producing more fission reactors since the 1970s, today the United States could have been largely powered by nuclear fission, and consequently we could be producing much less CO2, emitting much less CO2 into the atmosphere. But because of misguided extreme environmentalists beginning in the 1970s, we basically suffocated this tremendous source of energy. And we are paying the price for it. So yeah, I mean, superabundant future would partly be driven by cheap nuclear fission or fusion energy, and make energy too cheap to meter, which would be amazing because energy goes into everything, right? If you can lower the price of energy, then all your inputs become cheaper and therefore outputs become cheaper. But this kind of doom mongering, if you build this nuclear plant, fish will be floating about with 6 eyes and your children will be born with 2 heads. This kind of horrific fear-mongering, which is completely unconnected to reality, can have a profound impact on the future trajectory of economic growth and technological innovation. So yeah, absolutely. We have to be very aware of what it is that drives the media. It is not a story. Nobody writes about, or very few people write about the fact that 75% of all power in France is produced by safe and plentiful nuclear energy. Nobody writes about it. Nobody's interested in that. People are interested in nuclear accidents and Chernobyl and things like that.
And it's interesting because your book essentially goes about reversing the narrative. It almost is an institution in itself that, in addition to freedom, reinforces this idea of why freedom is so important and what needs to happen and what is happening. It's it's like the anti-media, except it's not. I don't know.
Well, look, traditionally media was very important because, media would uncover government or corporate malfeasance and things like that. But media was never perfect. Media always approached things from their own particular angle with their own particular biases. And to my mind, there are more biases in the media than ever before. Journalists stopped even pretending that they are even-handed. And more importantly, you have now much more competition in the media from not just, from digital outlets. And so the more horrific the headline, baby with 3 heads born in Pennsylvania near a nuclear power plant, that's sort of nonsense. They are all in the business of making money from clicks, and so they're driven by this negativity, and that can have an impact in many different varieties of ways. I mean, as I explained, the power of the free market is, of course, choosing between things that work and things that don't work, because people have a lot of ideas, right? I talked about people being the source of ideas which lead to innovations and then productivity gains. But many ideas that people have are bad ones. And how do you distinguish between a bad idea and a good idea? Well, you need the market to do that. But if the market is restricted, if the government puts into place regulations which basically say that certain things cannot even be considered, when the government picks winners and choosers in the marketplace, then this whole business of sorting between good and bad ideas basically disappears. And those powerful market signals that VHS is better than Betamax, or that Netflix is better than what was that video store called that went out of business? There
was no video store in my lifetime.
Yes. That was a video store. Blockbuster, right. So if
I saw it in a movie once.
That's right. If the government decides that Blockbuster is enough of an innovation and we don't need anything else because there's a convenient place where everybody can go and borrow a videotape, then that particular area of innovation is destroyed, and so it's very important to keep the markets free because they are the ones who are helping us to decide between good and bad innovations. And also, incredibly important is freedom of speech. I mean, as you know, we are having a conversation in the United States. Well, it's not so much a conversation as a sort of shouting match about the extent of free speech. But free speech is incredibly important because if you cannot communicate with another human being, if you cannot publish new ideas, if you cannot put them into practice, if you cannot speak and associate and exchange information because of some government codes, then that's a bad thing too, right? I'm thinking specifically here about research in genes and DNA, right? So we have this shouting match in the United States whether it is appropriate for people to keep on exploring genetic information and DNA. And let's imagine that it is forbidden to delve too deeply into differences between human beings. That would be horrific because we wouldn't be able to create new drugs that target specific people and their genetic peculiarities, right? Increasingly, if we want to help people, we need to be creating drugs which are specifically bespoke to them. But let's say that the government decides that we cannot continue to do that research because it is politically inconvenient. Then that's another area of research that can be destroyed, and that would have very negative consequences for future generations.
That's a great point. What I'm hearing in terms of media is that classical liberals and optimists have to be a little more innovative, and that I don't know. It's time to we have to figure out the way to get the positive to win. Except obviously, you're not going to read the story. What is that? You know that like positive news site that's like kind of a joke that's like only good news. And it's like the old man crossed the street successfully.
Well, there are a lot of them. There are a lot of these, including Human Progress, which I run, where we try to inform the public about positive news. We don't call ourselves necessarily optimistic. I used to, but I don't think it helps to, because it creates an impression that you are some sort of a Pollyanna, that you think that everything must work out. But as I keep on saying constantly, there's nothing in my research that says that everything has to work out. We could still destroy the world in a nuclear conflagration. But what I am saying is that if we keep true with freedom, economic and political, and reason and science and rationality and human dignity and equality before the law, then we can continue to improve things. So I don't necessarily call myself an optimist. I would say that I'm a realist, because the real state of the world is much better than what most people think it is, because they don't have access to all the positive news. They only have access to all the negative news. But for every negative news out there, there is a ton of positive news, which people will never read, because the newspapers have absolutely no incentive, financial or otherwise, of reporting on them, right? So I'm exaggerating, but only a little. So how do you do it? Well, it's not an easy task. If I knew how to do it, then I would probably be much more successful. And it's not easy, because we have evolved as human species to focus on the negative rather than the positive, right? I mean, when the world was much less hospitable to human beings than it is currently, it really paid to constantly be a lookout on danger, right? And that's what the first 300,000 years was like of our species on Earth. And only in the last 100 years or so that we've become so abundant and so prosperous that this kind of mental framework, this kind of mental hardware and software is no longer, strictly speaking, necessary. But we still have it, because we are hardwired to prioritize negative news. And so the best that we can do is to remind people that there is positive news out there, get them to sign up to all these newsletters, and hope that it will moderate their input or their intake of negative news.
But even in defense of human progress, compared to some of these sillier, like, oh, look, a bunny had babies sort of websites that are, first, obviously a joke, I think, in a lot of ways, or a somewhat unserious attempt at this, is that human progress tackles real problems that people like to see the negative in, and instead shows how that's a little bit misleading and not true. I think that's kind of one of the innovative ways of tackling this problem of negative media, is that instead of saying, oh, look at all these good things that happen, it's like, you think that this is a bad thing. Here's actually what's happening that's good about that, or with respect to that, or something like that, you know? Will you take that?
Yes. No, I do take it. I mean, I do think, don't take me wrong, I'm not I'm not throwing in the towel. I do think that on the margins we are making a lot of positive difference, in a sense that, I mean, that's why we are there, to remind people of all the positive things which are happening in the world. All I'm saying is that we have to work against human hardware and software, which has developed over hundreds of thousands of years, and it is an uphill struggle. And so the more people we have sort of repeating or amplifying some version of our message, the better. I mean, after all, the reason why we are having this conversation, the reason why I was excited to be on your podcast, is because you have a platform that can reach some students and who knows who else in the world, and who will maybe hear this positive message and the value of human beings and innovation for the first time in their lives.
Yeah, that's a good point. And you're doing a great job at it. What is one thing that you believed at one time in your life that you later changed your position on, and why?
Oh, gosh. I suppose, I don't know. I mean, that's pretty personal. But I like, for example, I used to believe in capital punishment. And then I realized that so many mistakes were made that in the legal system that I sort of started believing that it is much better to put people in prison for life. And so there's always a possibility that you can correct your mistake in the future. I used to be much more convinced, for example, about legalization of drugs, whereas now I think that what we should do is to run natural experiments. So, for example, I like the fact that we have a federalist system in the United States where different states can run their own experiments, and we can learn from one another and see what works and what doesn't. So those would be the kinds of things. I'm a huge fan of. I've become a much bigger fan of experimentation, such as state experimentation in the United States, than having a one solution for everyone. I guess I've become much more empirically driven than ideologically driven.
Once again, I'd like to thank my guest for their time and insight, and I'd like to thank you for listening to the Great Antidote podcast. The Great Antidote is sound engineered by Rich Goyette. If you have any questions, any guests or topic recommendations, please feel free to reach out to me at thegreatantidote@gmail.com. Thank you.